It's the late 1900s in New York City. The city pulses with energy. Broadway is booming, Harlem's Cotton Club echoes with Ellington's orchestra, and experimental composers are redefining what music can be. Radios hum in every apartment, and modern art, fast cars, and shifting social norms signal a new world. Now, imagine Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, born in 1900, not 1756, walking these streets as a young composer. He's not drawing inspiration from the courts of Europe, but from the skyscrapers, subways, and the symphonies of Traffic, Tin Pan Alley, and the Second Viennese School. How would a mind like his, restless and relentlessly creative, sound in an age where the past is fading and the future has just found its rhythm? Meet 1920s Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, born in Salzburg, city with Baroque and classical echoes, but very different by the dawning of the 20th century. Let's say he was still a prodigy, had trained at the Vienna Conservatory, and was aware of the late Viennese school and other movements going on in music at the time. And what if, since this is a more modern time, let's say he lived longer, from, say, 1900 to 1963 at the rise of Beatlemania? How would that prodigious mind, how would this genius write in this time period, the time of Ives, Stravinsky, Schoenberg, and Gershwin? We know Mozart was a child prodigy. So let's say, like the earlier Mozart, he would still start by touring Europe as a young person, wowing audiences, playing concertos from memory, and premiering his early works in his early teens. His knack for musical puzzles and intellectual stimulation would mean that he'd read the great writers of the day and also probably admire his contemporaries like Arnold Schoenberg and Gustav Mahler. I think that early Mozart, affected by his contemporaries, would write in a style drenched in late Romanticism, but I think he would still go for that crystalline clarity of thought. Also, we know that Mozart was a gifted genius at the piano. He's noted for his improvisational flair. So I'm sure that he would also be affected by the jazz scene around him, especially if, as in my thought experiment, he moves to New York in the mid-1920s. I don't know that he'd write a jazz concerto, but maybe he would do something a la Kurt Weill, writing sonatas or orchestral works that had certain jazz elements in them. Mozart was into experimentation, and I'm quite certain he would not neglect that element in his music. And as he matured as a musician, I'm sure that Mozart would experiment with polytonality. He wrote the Dissonance Quartet. There are moments in that where if you freeze frame it, it sounds almost atonal. So I'm sure polytonality wouldn't be much of a jump for Mozart. Perhaps, for example, he might layer two lines in a string quartet, a la Petrushka, one in C major and one in E major. He might blend these with contrapuntal writing, or maybe trade off melodies, or even do some motivic development in these two different simultaneous keys. I think the difference with Mozart is that he would use polytonality more to give it harmonic dimension, and not so much as a feature to shock the listener. What about the influence of Schoenberg? Think about 12-tone theory and even seriality. Schoenberg's invention, I'm sure, would intrigue Mozart, and I'm sure he would incorporate it in some of his works at some point in his career. But I think the difference with Mozart is that these melodies would always be incorporated into something singable, something memorable. Think of his operas, or even the melodies in his string quartets and symphonies. I think the rhythmic structures and the melodic shapes would still be identifiable as something Mozartian. So if you saw a Mozart opera in 1935 and it used serialism, I still think there would be melodies that you could whistle on your way home afterwards. I also think there'd be a folk music element, and I think this because you see it in Mozart's original music, such as the Turkish March or the peasant melodies in the Magic Flute. Maybe our 20th century Mozart would look at what Bartók is doing and capture some Austrian dances or Balkan melodies and put them together in a suite for winds, for example. Nationalism was a big thing in the late 19th century into the 20th century, so maybe he would even use things like Irish sea shanties, or since he's moved to New York, some American folk tunes and incorporate them into a movement of a symphony. Dvorak, Ralph Vaughan Williams, Kodai Bartók, these are famous composers that did the same thing, and I'm sure Mozart would be no exception. What about the operas? Mozart was a big opera composer, and if he lived in the 20th century, he might have written a lot of operas with that psychological undertone. Think of Magic Flute, Don Giovanni, with that subversive humor underlying the text and music. A 20th century Mozart might have liked to craft operas using libretti inspired by Kafka or Brecht, making sure that while everything was still singable, that it might have an underlying angst a la Webern or Berg. But then again, Mozart did like to write operas with immediate appeal to the audience. So maybe he would dig into his melodic genius and write something more along the lines of the Threepenny Opera or even Puccini's Turandot or Madama Butterfly. But I would be fascinated to see what sort of harmonic language Mozart would use for those operas. 20th century Mozart would definitely take advantage of the modern orchestra with all its tone colors afforded by all the modern instruments in the brass and wind sections especially. And don't forget the percussion with all the instruments that had been incorporated since the original Mozart's death. But even so, knowing Mozart's personality, I still imagine him writing, sometimes at least, using classical forms, that is, symphonies, string quartets, piano trios. I think when he wrote these large orchestral pieces, you would still see some of those, but maybe he would have some tone poems a la Richard Strauss. But Mozart being who he was, I do find it hard to imagine him completely abandoning absolute music, and I do see him still composing things like symphonies, string quartets, piano trios with multi-movements in them. Maybe they would be through composed, I don't know. It would be fascinating to find out. From jazz syncopations to serialism, from folk dances to psychological drama, I think Mozart would still be the cleverest, certainly the wittiest composer of his time, even if it was in the 20th century. Mozart's genius wasn't just in what he wrote, but in also how he listened to the world around him, to the voices of others, and to the possibilities within a single note, a single motive, a melody. Had he been born in 1900, he wouldn't have clung to tradition. He would have absorbed the chaos, beauty, dissonance of the modern world and still found clarity inside of it. But I'm interested to know what you think Mozart would have done had he lived 1900 to 1963. How would he have composed? What influences would he have absorbed? Would he still sound recognizably like Mozart? Please do let me know in the comments. And thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.